I use my husband and I a lot, but I use my husband and I because we are opposite in each of these preferences, right? And so if we're coming to a decision about how to parent, for example, a situation, the first place that Chad is going to go are the black and white rules.
Yes.
And probably the first place I'm going to go is the individual child.
Yes.
And say, this is what this individual child is capable of. He's going to say, this is the rule in our home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can get to the point where I'm like, you know what? We've got to be able to step into the rule of the home this time, right? Like that's what we've got to be able to do. But the first place I went, my first stop on my decision train was feeling, was the individualization of my children. Whereas Chad, his first stop is logic. Yes. And there might be sometimes where we land and he says, you know what, you're right. Our youngest was really tired. We didn't have him in a good situation overall. And maybe that's why he acted out in that. And we've got to take that into consideration.
Welcome to Personality Playbook. My name is Sadie Young.
And I'm Kayla Whittle.
And today I'm excited again.
Always excited.
I mean, if you're going to make a channel about something, I hope you're excited about it. Because it'd be pretty rough otherwise, right?
Absolutely.
Today we're going to talk about chalk. No, you see that? I'm not doing it for me.
No.
So today we're going to talk about thinking and feeling. And thinking and feeling, I've always hated the words that go
with the words. I agree. Totally hate the words.
Because, if you were to only think or only feel, that's definitely a mental disorder.
Yes.
It's a problem. So everybody thinks and feels, and that's not exactly what these words are about. These words are about the information that we prioritize when we're making decisions.
Yes.
So we always talk about the percentage of the population for each one of these. And we've arrived at my soapbox topic.
Okay.
So number 712. So with thinking and feeling, it is a 50-50 split in the population, but there is a gender difference.
Mm-hmm.
So people who prefer thinking make up, it's a 60-40 split. Men, 60% of men have a preference for thinking and 60% of women have a preference for feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is based on the 1998 sample, which obviously needs to be updated. If you were to go back to the sample before then, I think it was something along the lines of a 70-30 split.
Mm.
So, I'm just going to give you my personal thought on this, which is that it's probably actually a 50-50 split.
Right.
But that society trains men to be thinking types and trains women to be feeling types.
Right.
And that maybe one of these days it'll actually go to a 50-50 split.
Yeah, I agree. I think as we did workshops with people and as I've worked with individuals, helping women understand that they're a thinking type or helping a man understand that they're a feeling type has been really liberating. Like those are always really cool moments to have with them because they're like, okay, that's why I've always felt this like push and pull.
Exactly.
Like,
yeah. And so once again, Kayla and I are both intuitive feeling types. And so since I took sensing on the last video, Kayla's going to take thinking on this one and I'll take feeling. So she's going to get started talking about thinking types.
Yes, I'm going to talk about thinking types. So remember, as we're talking through, we're talking about how people like to make their decisions. So what types of things, what types of subjects, what types of evidence do people put together to be able to make what they feel like are the best decisions that they can make for themselves? Again, we're going to say it a million times. If you're a thinking type, you can feel.
and you do, even if you don't want to discuss it.
Exactly. But what you're going to do is you're going to step into making these decisions with logic. That's the first place that you're going to go, right? Mm-hmm. Is you're going to say, how can I utilize something that is logical, that is concrete, and that is objective to be able to make this decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they might, for example, if they're having to enforce a rule, right? Then they're going to say, this rule is the rule. And you have been, let's say the rule is that if you're late 3 times, you get written up. If you're late more than 10 minutes, 3 times, you get written up, right? A thinking type is going to say, that's the rule for every person walking in the door of this employment office, right?
Yeah.
You have now been late more than 10 minutes 3 times, and you will be written up because I've stepped into logic. I've made that decision, and I'm using this like concrete information to make that decision, right?
Yes.
And that feels the most fair and equitable way to make a decision, right? Because individualization for a thinking type can feel unfair,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas they're going to feel like justice must be handled across the board the same for everyone, right? Like that's kind of like this place where it feels most right and just is to be able to say the rule is the rule. It applies to everyone equally.
Yeah. In the same way.
In the same way, right? And that to a feeling type could feel a little bit cold and detached, right? Because they could say, oh, well, you know, what if that was a mom and, you know, she's a single mom and she's trying to get her kids to school and she does great work, but she's been late, you know, 3 times more than 10 minutes. That's different than somebody who is single and they don't have anything else to do in the morning but to get to work, right? Right? Because a feeling type is probably, and she can talk more about that, is probably going to individualize that a little bit more.
Yes.
Whereas that individualization feels inherently unfair to a thinking type, right? Like it doesn't matter what your situation is. This is the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
This is the rule. And to be right, fair, and just, we must follow that.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. That's not me agreeing with what, but with that being how thinking types think about it.
But
So feeling, people always talk about feeling types being very emotional and, almost as though feeling types can't control their emotions.
right.
And that's not really what it's like. I usually like to describe, instead of saying that feeling types make decisions based on their feelings, I usually like to say they make them based on their own personal set of values.
Right. That's right.
But they're very subjective, whereas thinking types are very objective.
Yeah.
So these are people who focus on relationships. When you hear people say, I don't want to upset that person, maybe they'll avoid saying something difficult because they don't want to hurt that person's feelings. They don't want that person not to like them anymore. That's a very feeling type way of going about things. And so this is somebody who's going to be subjective in that what you were talking about. I usually use the example of somebody who called and said they were going to be late because they had a flat tire is different than somebody who has a hangover every, Monday morning. Doesn't, so a feeling type is going to want to treat the person differently, that it made sure that they knew that, this thing was going on and that they were going to be late, versus the person who just clearly doesn't care about your job.
Sure.
I talk a lot about motivation with these because I think sometimes people struggle with deciding if they're a thinking or a feeling type because, thinking and feeling types may ultimately decide to do the same thing as each other.
Absolutely.
But they're going to get to it in different ways. It's based on, sometimes feeling types will treat people the same way because they think that's the best thing for the relationships is to treat you. Does that make sense?
Right.
And so I think people struggle with that sometimes. So I always like to say, I know when I first started doing this, I was taught that thinking types believe in fairness and feeling types believe in mercy, more so. Mm-hmm. But I've always described it as that both people believe in fairness, but feeling types say that fairness is based on the individual situation.
Exactly. It's the definition of fairness. Like, what does justice mean to a feeling type versus what does justice mean to a thinking type?
Yes. And it's very much individualistic versus it's keeping the person in mind versus keeping the rules in mind.
Right.
Even though that ends up sounding like thinking types don't care about people,
right,
which is not true.
Right.
I think because of that, I always found this to kind of be the most difficult one to figure out for a lot of people.
The way I land on it typically in discussing it is it's the first place you go. Because where we land, I think if we're reasonable people, where we're going to land is probably going to be a decision that has been both felt and thought through. Right. If it's a big decision, right? No matter what side you're on. But where is the first place that you go? And I know I use my husband and I a lot, but I use my husband and I because we are opposite in each of these preferences, right? And so if we're coming to a decision about how to parent, for example, a situation, the first place that Chad is going to go are the black and white rules.
Yes.
And probably the first place I'm going to go is the individual child.
Yes.
And say, this is what this individual child is capable of. He's going to say, this is the rule in our home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can get to the point where I'm like, you know what? We've got to be able to step into the rule of the home this time, right? Like that's what we've got to be able to do. But the first place I went, my first stop on my decision train was feeling, was the individualization of my children. Whereas Chad, his first stop is logic. Yes. And there might be some times where we land and he says, you know what, you're right. Our youngest was really tired. We didn't have him in a good situation overall. And maybe that's why he acted out in that. And we've got to take that into consideration. But the first stop on his decision train, which now I'm using that metaphor, so here we are. The first stop on his decision train is that logic place. So the destination that we can arrive to, like I said, I think any fair, reasonable person who's making a careful decision is going to stop in multiple stops on their train before they arrive at their destination, right? I think most like reasonable adults who care about the decision that they're making are going to think through and feel through the decision.
Right.
But think about as you're trying to decide, which side of this preference you're on, where do you go first?
Right.
As it relates for justice? Where is the first place that you land? Do you have to think your way into feeling a little bit, right? Or do you have to feel your way into thinking a little bit?
One of my favorite stories that my mentor, Nancy Barger, used to tell, she used to talk about when her kids came home from school with their report cards.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was a feeling type and her husband was a thinking type. And so let's say that her kid came home and had 2 A's, a B, a C, and an F in the report card.
Mm-hmm.
And her husband would say, you really need to work on that C and that F. You got to get those up. And, those were the first words out of her husband's mouth. And the first words out of her mouth were, you did so great. You got an A in 2 subjects.
Right.
It's not that she didn't see the other half of the report card, but she wanted to make sure that she gave that positive experience first. So I think feeling types tend to notice what's right with a situation when they first look at it. Thinking types tend to look at what's wrong and needs to be fixed.
Sure.
First off.
That's fair.
And that is where all arguments come from. Yeah.
But I think it is a great place to talk about venting.
Oh, for sure. Yes.
Yeah.
And certainly our animation for the visual learners is going, that's what it demonstrates in this particular one. But yeah, I think, and of course, that's not where all arguments come from, but it's definitely where a lot of arguments come from in relationships. For the visual learners, for thinking and feeling, we're going to look at how thinking types and feeling types approach situations and how they have a conversation between each other. So once again, I will mention that these animations that I made years ago are based on drawings that were done in my certification course for Myers-Briggs, which were done by Nancy Barger, who is my beloved mentor. So with that, here we go with thinking and feeling for the visual learners. So here we have a poor, sad, crying person, and we have a thinking type, and we have a feeling type. And the thinking type is going to step back from the situation and say, what has caused this person to become upset, and how can it be really reasonably fixed? Whereas the feeling type, if they feel comfortable doing so, if they feel like they know the person a little bit, is going to step into the situation and say, oh, I'm so sorry you're upset. I'm here if you need an ear to listen, a shoulder to cry on, or anything else. End scene. Next, I'm going to give you a warning. Warning, what you're about to see is a dramatization portrayed by trained actors. I know this because I trained them myself when I was making the illustration. It illustrates a very stereotypical conversation between thinking and feeling types, but I'm going to guess that you're going to recognize this in your life somewhere. I think we've all had this conversation. So the feeling type comes home from work and the thinking type says, how is your day today? And the feeling type says, terrible. My boss yelled at me because I turned my work in 5 minutes late and I have way too much to do. And I'm so frustrated because I don't want her to think I'm a bad employee and I think she hates me. So the thinking type, of course, is going to respond. Maybe it would be a good idea to look at how you manage your time so that you don't get your work in late again. And perhaps you could talk to her about your workload if it's still too much after that. Now, how do you think this is about to go over? The feeling type says, my time management skills are fine and I can handle my workload. I know everything will be okay. I just had a really bad day and I need to vent. I don't need you to fix it. And the poor thinking type says, wait a minute, when did this person get mad at me? What did I do? How did this happen? I was just trying to offer a solution because obviously you're having a problem, right? So how many of you think that you've had this conversation in your life? I really am betting it's about 100%. And I hope these actors will take a bow for their beautiful skills in explaining this situation. All right, so now that we're back from the visual learning piece, you can see that those guys had kind of a rough argument, and that's what we were talking about with feeling versus thinking and having a lot of misunderstandings.
Sure.
One thing that I didn't specifically mention before is we talk about feeling types being very person-centered, and that sounds very warm and fuzzy, doesn't it?
It does.
It sounds like a big snuggie, and
Right.
that you hug everybody, and some people are like, I'm not that sweet. I'm not that nice to people. And, honestly, while thinking types really get a reputation for being cold, I would say that thinking types are, and most of them will tell you, like, they weren't trying to hurt anybody's feelings
Right.
when they just stuck with the rules.
Right.
A feeling type might have been trying to hurt your feelings. And I'm,
Or manipulate your feelings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is still person-centered. So
So I have an example of that.
great.
So I gave the parenting example earlier in the video about Chad and I, and him saying, well, this is the rule for our family, versus me saying, hey, he had a hard night, he was tired, right? And then we kind of land on this decision that we're going to get to. So let's say one of the children has done something that has made me really angry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really, really upset in the middle of it. In that moment, I want Chad to handle it, because he's like, you broke the rule. Here's the consequence. You have time out. We're going to move forward. And I appreciate the coldness,
Yeah.
right? Because for me, I might come in too hot, right? Like I might come in and utilize that anger and yell and just like, how could you do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And discipline out of that feeling anger place,
Yeah.
instead of being able to discipline with both feeling and thinking happening at the same time.
Yeah. And that's that taking it personally.
Exactly, right? So
Feeling
like
types will tend to
that, like using that inflammatory response,
Sure.
right, is also a feeling response too.
Yeah.
So it's important, like feeling types, it's not all like unicorns and rainbows and happy and loving. Emotions are a broad range of feelings that we have. And sometimes it can be anger, and that's an ugly place to be, but we have to be self-aware enough to know that that might be something that we jump to or that we utilize as we're jumping to a decision. And we either have to cool and calm down and get ourselves settled so that we're not making hasty decisions, or we get to rely on the cool, calm, collected thinking person, right? Who's like, sorry, that was the rule, you broke it, and here's what we're going to do.
Sure. And they certainly may be angry too.
Absolutely.
But they're probably going to handle it in a little more detached fashion
Right.
than a feeling type is going to, because we're, if we get mad, we're mad.
Yeah.
And we have to learn. Now, as we will always have to say, that's not an excuse. You can't say, I'm going to blow your head off because I'm angry.
Yeah.
I'm a feeling type, so what do you want me to do? No,
Right,
you can't do that. You have to understand that piece about yourself and come up with, different types depending on your other preferences are going to handle that differently.
Sure.
Whether they need to go talk it out with somebody that is not in the situation, or whether they need to just go away and be by themselves for a minute to calm down. but it's definitely something we need to be aware of. Just as with thinking types, they need to be aware that fixing everything is not necessarily what we're going for.
Absolutely.
So I know you wanted to talk a little bit about
about venting. Yes. Well, you saw the animation, which hopefully helped understand that. But there are times when, and this is also playing in a little bit to the fact that I'm an extrovert.
Sure.
So there are times when something has upset me or made me sad or made me mad, and I'm upset about it, and I just need to process it out loud and talk it all out and get the feeling out. And at the end of it, even if nothing is resolved, I'm probably going to be at a better spot than I was when I started, which again, that's tying together a little bit of extroversion as well, right?
Sure.
Because I needed that external place to process. My husband is wonderful, but he early on in our marriage was very much like, okay, well, you wouldn't be so upset about that maybe if you did X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Right? And
Remember that goes over so well.
Now I'm more upset.
Now I'm mad at you.
Right? So as we're married longer, he'll even ask the question now, like, do you want my advice about this, or do you just need to like get it all out? Right. And that's such a valuable question for thinking types.
Oh,
that's such a valuable question for them to ask.
Recommended. That's like a professional tip for your relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're a thinking type, whether you're the male or the female in the relationship, if you're a thinking type, just pause for a minute and say, hey, is this something that you want help with? Because there are times that I do want to chat, like, hey, I really want you to tell me what you think about this. And there are times that that's not what I'm looking for.
Yes.
So I have to be aware enough to know what it is that I want.
Yes.
And Chad has to be aware enough to be able to say, is this something that you want from me right now for advice? Or do you just need kind of the air and the space to get it all out? And then you're going to feel better at the end. Right.
And if you have a partner that does not know to ask that, you can suggest that they ask it. And I would also say you can announce that.
Right. At the beginning, I do not need you to fix this. I just need to say that I'm really frustrated right now, and this is why.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I just need you to give me 5 minutes. And I know that your tendency is to want to fix this, but I'm just going to need to go blah, 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 until I get this out of my system.
Right.
And I will tell you that introverts definitely have that going on too. So I'm probably only going to get that way with my person or somebody that is one of my close people.
Right.
But when I get a situation where I have that frustration going on, I call it tornado brain, which I think is kind of an introvert thing. Maybe it's not completely, but those emotions start swirling around in my brain so fast, it's like somebody turned a blender on in my head, and I have to get that out.
Right.
But I'm not going to get it out to just anybody. I'm going to...
Your people.
Yeah, I'm going to go to one of my people, and I'm pretty much just going to, barf all that up on them.
Right.
So, because otherwise you get too much in your head, and it goes to the bad place.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think something that Chad and I discuss a lot is also setting the tone in the room. And a feeling type has a little bit of a contagion as it relates to that, right? So a feeling type that's in a good mood, whether you're introverted or extroverted in your home, if a feeling type that's in a good mood can really set the tone of the mood in the home.
Yeah.
And a feeling type that's really angry can set the tone for the mood in the home. And it's kind of like being a thermostat, sure, for your house. And so, kind of like being aware that exists as this kind of cool little, it can be cool or it can be dangerous. Little power that we have, right?
You start to hear people's footsteps get quieter if they, if they're aware of what's going on in the household, and they're like, we don't want to mess with that one today.
Yeah, because they've learned.
It can definitely be difficult.
And then just maybe to touch on one more time, kind of these gender stereotypes that are related to thinking and feeling. So I know that in individual counseling with women who are thinking types, they often feel like they have had to apologize for that about themselves over their lifetime. Like, I must be thinking about this wrong, or I must be a harsh person, right? Like the belief that I'm harsh or hardened, or that there's something wrong with me as a female who goes to thinking first, right?
Sure.
And they either skip that completely and try to do a weird version of feeling, which happens sometimes.
And then they're accused of being not genuine.
Exactly, because they're like, I don't know, like, I guess I was supposed to act this way. And they feel really unsettled with that, because the first place their brain goes is thinking. And it doesn't matter that they're a female, but society has said that women are more emotional, or that they emote more, or whatever the case may be. Yeah. And so they think that they have to present themselves in a way that's not authentic. And that can be read from others. And so when I say that there's like liberation, and it's when a female can sit down and say, this is just my preference and how my brain works. And that's okay, right? Like, I don't have to be a fake version of myself because I'm a female. I can just be the real version of who I am.
Well, and a lot of times I've seen that thinking type females end up being very nicely balanced.
Yeah.
With having a lot of, they are thinking types, and being able to admit that they are thinking types and claim that is a beautiful thing.
Right.
Will set you free. But they also, because of society, have developed a lot of feeling skills that can be super helpful.
Absolutely.
But you still, that's that place where, maybe they want to say that they're both. But it's freeing to be able to claim that you're a thinking type and to be able to accept that in yourself.
Right.
And I've always thought it was kind of interesting, because it seems like thinking type women catch a lot more flack for being thinking types than feeling type men do.
I was just about to say the same thing.
Because it seems like feeling type men, you see that and you go, it's a sensitive man.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing.
Right. Like, that he cares about things or people.
And that's something we're not used to seeing in society. But at the same time, I think the man himself may struggle with feeling that he's not like he's supposed to be, even though people on the outside generally are good with that.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So internally, male feeling type could think, I am too sensitive. Or maybe they've been told, by female or by the leaders in their home, or the leaders that are around them, that they're too sensitive.
Yeah.
Could be that, like, hey, stop crying or whatever, But it could be also that they're a feeling type male, and that they need to understand that maybe that's where a lot of their anger is coming from.
Yes, that's you pulled that out of my brain.
Yeah. So again, like, feeling type, we have to emphasize that, yes, it is person focused, but it's very emotional, right? And those emotions can be kind and friendly, and they can be angry and inflammatory. And so if you're dealing with a male who society has said, don't be too emotional, the only safe emotion for them to express is anger.
Yeah.
Right. And so that can happen too with males who are feeling types, is that the only safe place they can go that's tough is this anger place.
And I think that in most cases, I'm thinking of a particular person that probably the rudest person I have ever met was a feeling type male.
Mm.
And he got under my skin every which way it was possible. And that's really where I learned that this was not all a warm and fuzzy situation.
Yeah.
And I just, everything this person did just, oh boy, got under my skin. And so the more I learned about this person, the more I learned that his upbringing was in a very, very, very rough environment.
Yeah.
Like in a rough city kind of situation where most people were shooting each other and, in like a gang type situation.
Sure.
And that this person had actually interpreted that cold, detached thinking piece as anger. Mm-hmm. If that's not where you naturally go, you look for the closest thing to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that person ended up thinking that bossing people around was manly.
Sure.
And,
Right.
when I was the boss. I was like, we're not doing that here.
Right. Right.
No.
She's not bossy. She's the boss.
Right. Yeah, there's a difference. And so, but honestly, it helped me tremendously learning learning the background on that situation, because otherwise I was like, you clearly don't know what's happening here.
Right. Right.
But the truth was, I didn't know what was happening there either. I wasn't understanding where that person had come from. And we came to a reasonable understanding.
Yeah.
Have to be able to work together. But, I really had to understand how that grated on my last nerve when I was around that person, so that I would be able to manage my own person-centeredness of not going to the place where I'm like, you.
Right.
You
And
talk like that.
If we want to discuss just briefly here, faith.
Yeah.
Right. So as someone is drawn to a faith, if they're a thinking type, they can be comforted and excited about the laws. Right. Like, okay, this is logical. And we all have this rule book that we need to follow as it relates to our faith.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Whereas a feeling type is going to be drawn to the intimacy and relationship.
Sure.
Right. That can come in a faith community. Or, if we're talking specifically about the Christian faith, that relationship with Christ, right? Like having a person to go to and emote to and to pray to, right? Like that relational piece is the draw in for a feeling type. Whereas the law is a beautiful draw in for thinking types.
Well, and I think too, as a feeling type, when I hear those laws, I'm not afraid that I'm going to break the rules because I'm going to break the rules.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm afraid that if I break the rules, I will be disappointing. God.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where feeling types tend to go on that piece. And it's the same as relationships with people. I'm afraid if I break your rules that you're not going to like me anymore.
Right.
And that I have failed in that relationship sort of way.
Right.
Whereas, like you're saying, thinking types go, okay, I know how to make this work because you have given me laws.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's literally about any decision that we make in our lives, whether that be about within our relationships, because we're constantly having to make decisions as couples or even in friendships, and how we make decisions about how we're going to move forward in that, or our faith or our jobs, right? Like, this is really an intricate part of all that we do. And I would say causes the most tension of any two preferences.
Yeah.
Is the tension that exists between the thinking type and the feeling type, no matter what capacity we're talking about relationship, right? Because we really are always walking through every day, taking information and solving problems.
Yes.
And while we're solving those problems, everybody has a different method of solving them. And so that will kind of create this kind of push and pull all the time. So if there is any preference that's the most confrontational, or that causes the most confrontation, it's going to be thinking and feeling.
Yeah. And if there's any preference set that causes the most confusion,
sure,
sensing and intuition.
Yes.
I would say.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the one where you're like, what are you saying? Are we saying the same thing?
Yeah.
If we're saying the same thing. And this is the one where it's like, you came to a weird place on that. And,
right.
How did you get there, and why would you go that way about it?
Yeah.
So, when you put those two things together, that's absolutely why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Because learning about your perception and judgment and other people's perception and judgment, it's amazing how you can go from thinking that somebody is purposefully trying to drive you crazy to realizing that you're just different and that you actually both mean well.
Right. And that there's so much value in each of your perspectives, which again, I said I was going to mention in every video, but I really and truly believe that is that, I think the first step is becoming aware of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get to be aware of the world around us and how other people operate. Right. And then I think the next step that we get to take from there is beginning to value and appreciate those differences.
Yes. And we'll even cover that once we get to the zigzag method of decision making, which helps you cover, make sure that even though you have your own type, that you're looking at all of the preferences when you make a decision so that you're getting all of the information out there.
Right.
But of course, that's for another video. And because, I'm intuitive, I'm always looking forward.
I love it. Yes.
So we thank you so much for being with us today. Stay tuned for our next video, which is going to be about judging and perceiving. And that video is going to wrap up the 4 sets of preferences and being able to move into some other pieces of type.
Yep.
So we hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.